we now move on, our next speaker, Tristan Kitchener, knows grocery retail inside out. A former group merchandise manager for fresh produce at Coles and now director of a consulting firm specialising in fresh foods and supply chains, Tristan will examine how rising costs, shifting consumer behaviour and innovation redefine value in grocery retail. Please welcome Tristan to the stage.
Afternoon, great. So, just to get straight into it, let's go one more. Are we on? Not yet. I got you surprised there. Yeah, fantastic. So, let's go back. Just to set the scene in terms of, I guess, where we are now versus the pre-COVID, post-COVID period. The impact on liquidity, on debt. We've heard about some of these things this morning. Inflation, which is sort of backing off, but is still significant. We've had this cost of living crisis, the squeeze on prices, costs going up, really moving from globalization to this more sort of protectionist, tariff-fueled market. And the volatility we've seen as well. And then these three who've just put a load of uncertainty into the market. So probably more unpredictable than the market's been for the sort of last 30, 40 years. What I was going to try and cover today was around this, some of the aspects around the future state of where retailers and consumers are heading. How do we capture value? And a little bit about reflection, and I'm going to try and not stand on any landmines around what's happened in Australia with the grocery inquiries, which there's been a lot of attention there. And I guess the message is that wherever you sit within the horticulture supply chain, it doesn't matter if you're not a retailer, you've got a vested interest in making sure that the consumer's needs are getting met as consistently as possible. So you're a seed company, your haulage or whatever, we all have to make sure it works for the consumer. Looking at consumers, I think across any Western market, you can see that it's almost a two-speed market of the haves and have-nots. Essential spend, so if you're a commodity supplier, say your potatoes versus perhaps cherries on the right-hand side, that essential or discretionary spend is going to be quite different. So you can see that the consumers that are younger, that have probably got mortgages, interest rates, disposable income is less, versus the older people have got much more money. They're getting 4 or 5% on their money. They're actually probably wealthier than they ever have been. So we see this sort of the younger cash-strapped, the older wealthier. And if you take this forwards, and this qualitative study here looked at how consumers are managing the cost of living. And if you say, well, what's value? It's that trade-off between price and quality. We see these sort of behaviours around looking for items on promotion, the cheaper products, less regularly buying expensive treats and food waste. And in produce, we're particularly seeing the switch out of fresh into frozen. Meat are experiencing, particularly red meat, with consumers trading down to more affordable proteins like chicken and eggs, and then this eating out in. So you may not be able to afford to go out to dinner, food service, restaurants, etc., but you can afford to go to the supermarket, buy your meal, and then eat that in. So that seems to be continuing whilst these sort of affordability issues are still there. And I guess when you say, well, who's winning from a retailer perspective around this, and this is slightly Australian-centric, but is really the hard discounters. Costco, Aldi, those hard discounter retails are really picking up share from the bigger incumbents. And it's interesting, if you look at the European market, which I know is important to many of you here, and you see which retailers are growing, and this slide just really tracks the sort of sales on the left versus all these retailers around down the bottom. And the hard discounters, the Lidls, the Aldi, which is a very similar model, versus, and Kaufland as well, which is a hard discounter that was going to come into Australia at one stage, much, much bigger than even huge retailers like Tesco and Carrefour. And the predictions are that these are the retailers that are going to really grow. And the hard discounters are essentially businesses that retailers that run the everyday low price strategies. So it's not high-low pricing, it's that EDLP, it's the same price, it's a deal every day of the week. Limited range, it may be 1,500, 1,800 product lines versus the large service retailers of 25, 30,000 product lines. High private label. And any market that has high labor costs, high store rent, and perceived to be big retailer margins is attracted to the discounters, which obviously suggests that Australia and New Zealand are highly attractive. And when you look at what's happened with the evolution of Aldi, they've just got a couple of videos to play. It just shows you where they've gone from in terms of their value proposition and where they're heading now. So pretty simple. That was sort of like, 2015, 2016. It's all about value, yeah? And the other thing is Aldi's a German supermarket, and everyone thought they didn't have a sense of humor, so they thought, we'll reset that. So it's a bit of, it's lighthearted. When you go to the UK market, and it's good to look at the UK market, because the UK, from a product perspective, is almost the canary in the coal mine for what happens across this side in Australia and New Zealand. Consumers shop quite similarly from a product perspective. And you now move into any of the major four, and it's a very concentrated, very competitive market in the UK, as you probably know. You walk into any retailer, the first thing you'll see is Aldi and Lidl prices being advertised. And what's extraordinary about this is this is an Asda, number 4 retailer, that's now been knocked off number 4 by Lidl, which has now moved into that place. So it ultimately means that Aldi is setting the retail price globally. And Aldi's in 19 countries. It's probably, if you put it in Australian context, it'll be probably 5 or 6 times the size of Coles and Woolworths combined. It's a huge, huge business. So their buying power is enormous. And what you're seeing is this price matching behavior coming in, and we're seeing it now in Australia, and it's leading to Aldi really having that control over price. So this is Aldi driving everyday low price. So you want a deal? Shop in Aldi every day of the week. And that's putting pressure on the incumbents to move away from this high-low pricing strategies. And the result for fresh produce in the UK has been pretty disastrous. So this was, I was back in Easter, and this is a Tesco store in the UK, where you can see all fresh produce, really those main lines that probably count for sort of 70-80% of the volume, discounted to 15p. So that's not the grower or the supplier taking the hit, it's the retailer taking the hit. So what happens is Aldi comes out as 15p, and every other retailer has to price match. And the whole market's deflated. And then Lidl do the same, and then Tesco's and Sainsbury's do the same, Marks and Spencer's, Waitrose, they all follow suit. The difference being that the Sainsbury's, Tesco's will say, well, you're only going to get the deal if you have your loyalty card, your club card, and it's, consumers go, well, here's my loyalty card, which one do you want? Because I'm loyal to everybody, which means I'm loyal to nobody. And 15p for 2 kilos of potatoes. It's not great for brand produce when you're trying to communicate the value that produce has to consumers. And this is something that the UK is navigating at the moment, and it's causing a lot of pain. What we're also seeing is that Aldi are now evolving into a stage whereby they are forming long-term partnerships with suppliers, 20-year deals. I don't think anyone across this side of the world, I know Coles is doing 10-year deals. I'm not sure what's happening in the New Zealand market. But as growth becomes harder, retailers will leverage their capital and leverage their ability to give long-term contracts. And that's going to hinge on the mindset, trust, and capability of the suppliers to be able to deliver on that. But you can see this is the sort of new wave of things coming out. Now, what does this mean for you as New Zealand producers and from an export perspective? So to combat the hard discounters, if you are supplying to markets into those 19 countries where Aldi is present, there's things that the competitor retailers will have to do in order to differentiate from Aldi. And it's going to be things like price, clear, good, better, best architecture, with an Aldi price point, match that price point at the beginning. It'll then be around promotions, fewer and deeper, to try and match on that everyday low price. And consumers want to know what they're going to get, so they want that price certainty. Range, if there's duplication of range, is going to get cut. And I think you'll see these retailers wanting to leverage on what Aldi's not good at, which is generally anything that's a bit different, takes up a lot of investment in cool chain or cooked chickens as an example. Those will be the sort of differentiators. The loyalty cards, which is just a source of data, personalization, heard about it this morning. How can I get closer to consumers and actually personalize the shopping experience for them? And then the online, that consumers are omni-channel. They don't shop just in bricks and mortar or online. They're a blended approach. But ultimately, it will be doing more for less. That will be the outcome in those markets, and we've certainly seen that in Australia. And just before I move off Aldi, there is the question. I think a lot of Kiwis probably saying, "Is Aldi going to come to New Zealand?" And I think this is one of the questions that Aldi gets asked most commonly. And the answer, I think, is that Aldi will open up a store anywhere there's a catchment of 20,000 people, which is not that much. And it's that hub-spoke model: one DC, 60, 70 stores, another DC, another 60 or 70 stores. It's a pretty simple model. And at the moment, there's so much growth opportunity in Australia, expanding over to the west and increasing store density, that New Zealand is probably less of a priority. But given New Zealand is a price-sensitive market, I'm trying to say that really politely, you're quite frugal, savvy consumers, the Kiwis. You're actually the most price-sensitive market in of all Western countries. $60 out of every 100 is spent on promotions, and in Australia it's 40. So it does mean that the New Zealand market is quite attractive to Aldi. So I think it's probably a case of when rather than if. And interestingly, when Costco, who's another hard discounter, opened in Auckland, that was their most successful and biggest taking store. I think in their first week, they had 100,000 consumers sign up. So that's the biggest store opening they've ever had. Okay, just moving on. Just want to pick a few things to talk around from a consumer perspective. And this just looks at health. And, on the vertical axis is the counter categories. Along the bottom, household penetration. So how many households are actually buying in those categories? And the size of the bubble is the actual dollar growth. So if you're at the top right, that's the sort of more kind of growth areas in terms of those health attributes. And what we're seeing is a number of other things coming out: protein, bone strength, all these other things as well. And the message here is that brands and businesses are getting much more focused in talking about specific health attributes as opposed to it's healthy, which doesn't really move the dial. So kiwi fruit, Zespri's done an amazing job owning immunity with vitamin C, Californian walnuts for brain health, blueberries going into Asia, which is retargeted around young girls and eye health, particularly they're studying. And then what you're also seeing now is this impact of the GLP-1 drugs. And a question was asked about this earlier. And it's probably a good thing for produce, but the data isn't robust enough to conclusively say that. So it's thought that around about, almost 5 to 10% of the population could end up on these drugs. And once you're on them for life. You don't go in and out. So it's not like a diet fad. But the fact is, consumption goes down. You consume less, you get out of the sort of high-fat, sugar, salty foods, and it's less snacking. So grocery brands, probably not great. What it means for produce is possibly quite good, in the sense that it's about nutrient density, satiety, snack-friendly formats, conveniences, those sorts of things. And interestingly, what you also do see is when something happens in brands, it flows through to private label. What happens in grocery flows through to fresh. And one of the first moves is always the grocery businesses who get on it, the grocery brands. They're already marketing up here, GLP-1 friendly food. So the logos are going on. So they see this opportunity. And the other thing about these products is around natural processing methods. And again, this is an example from the US. It's a smoothie. It's lightly processed. So it's preserving the taste and it's preserving the nutrition. This is a UK example. I've tried it. It's outstanding. And when you look at what they say, it's amazing. It's all this, utilizing minimal non-thermal processing to provide the highest nutritional value and a fresh, authentic taste. So you can see how it's being positioned to fit in with the attributes that the GL1P consumers are going to want. And then you also have the big end of town, Pepsi getting involved and saying, prebiotic cola. When you get big brands, the sugar brands saying that, what you can take from it is the insight must stack up. It's absolutely incredible they're doing this because it just doesn't resonate, but it does say that the consumer attribute is probably valid. Okay, next one, sustainability. So sustainability is talked about a lot, and it means different things to different people. It's probably plastic food waste for consumers, shareholders, it's all about carbon. And the point is, whether you believe it or not, it doesn't really matter because ultimately the consumer feels that, it's part of the future. If you're not part of the solution, then you're clearly part of the problem. And the bigger you are as a business, the greater the social license and the greater the need to be seen to be doing something. The struggle and the rub is that 78% of consumers want it but don't want to pay for it. So does this just flow down the supply chain and end up as another cost on the producer? I should probably say as well, I actually have a cherry business, so I do have a bit of a producer, and I supply to the major retailers in Australia, so I do have a bit of a producer lens in me. So this is certainly a fear. So when you look at this from a retailer's perspective, they're basically saying, well, look, consumers want a climate-friendly meal. They can go out and buy their meat, their produce, their carbohydrate. It's all sustainable, it's all carbon-friendly. For the retailer, the difficulty is how do you communicate that? How do you source that? And there's no real kind of holistic solution out there at the moment. So in the UK, there's been a few trials with these sorts of very unfriendly traffic light systems. It's independently third-party certified. This is an example from Woolworths, South Africa, that started this regenerative agricultural program in 2014. And since then, I've been saying this is the only retailer in the world that's doing it. And then yesterday, a retailer came out, Lidl, saying, actually, we're going to launch this Live Well logo, which is around health, plant-based products, and sustainability. And interestingly, they piggybacked on established brands in each of those spaces to give them credibility. And somewhat amusingly, Lidl, who's part of the Schwartz Group, which I think is the fourth biggest retailer in the world, and is German-owned, said, as UK supermarkets, which they're not, we must go further if we're serious about supporting healthier lives and sustainability. So it's interesting how they see that is something that needs to happen. And when you ask consumers, does this mean something to you, you're seeing, well, yes, it does, particularly with the younger demographics, but less so. As affordability and cost of living prices are squeezing, you can see, no surprise, it's just coming down a little bit, and it's those sort of things that are, sourcing, recyclability rising, and those other aspects which are declining. So it's still relevant, it's just, it is angling downwards. And then the question is, can you monetize sustainability? So if you put a sustainable credentials on your product, will you get a price premium? And the data suggests, no, you won't, unless you do it with something else. So this was a Nielsen study with Hort Innovation in Australia. They looked at a number of products in different categories, and they compared the price with and without sustainability credentials. And essentially, if you put sustainability with something else, whether it's indulgent or efficiency, you could get a premium. But in its own right, you wouldn't. You might get preferential treatment by a retailer who says, well, I'll choose you over your competitor who doesn't have anything, but it's more about, it's no kind of price premium that comes with that. And I think a message is that, this whole social license piece of, well, you've got to do something. Just, you may have seen this in the press with Wimbledon banning avocados because they perceived it was being, brought by, too much cost and the supply chain was inefficient and was not sustainable. And they banned it without any reaction, they just banned it at Wimbledon, and that caused massive headlines everywhere. So the question is, what is the Achilles heel for your industry, and how do you combat that? Avocados actually came out and said, well, we use water more efficiently than anyone else, as any other category. So that was their reaction to it. So the third consumer attribute, just around convenience. And I think convenient veg has done convenience so well, and it's value added. It taps into frozen and fresh, tapped into the trends for air-friendly frying because of reducing energy costs. In the UK, the government is now giving old age pensioners air fryers to reduce their energy bills. Tapping into multi-buy mechanics, loyalty promotions to drive repeat purchase and coming back to the category, and really, really cheap. Some of these products you look at, you go, why would I not buy it in this format? It is so cheap. And if we look at fruit, and again, this is data from 2005 to 2025, and per capita consumption of fruit in the UK is about flat. Hasn't changed for 20 years. You see that fruit, however, in terms of these products, the grapes and the mandarins and berries, is now 30% of the fruit sales, of total fruit sales, whereas whereas other fruit, apples, pears, and oranges have significantly reduced in terms of their contribution of total fruit. And it's probably, you probably put the mangoes, avocados in that taste and seasonality aspect. It's around for longer, newer varieties. Certainly convenience for grapes, easy peel mandarins, berries. But interestingly, it's not linked to price. These products are way more expensive on a per kilo basis. So it's just interesting to see how that's played out. And the challenge you might see for apples is it's a crowded space. There's more varieties going in, and there's not necessarily varieties coming out. So it's it could be some challenge around that. So capturing value in a price-driven market, just looking at this from a retailer lens. So when retailers look at fresh produce, they look at different categories, different strategies. It's not all produce together, it's broken down. And generally, it's into these 4 segments. There's an element of destination versus impulse purchase, but then are they staple commodities versus, say, at the bottom, the more seasonal commodities? And this lot at the bottom, the expandable consumption, is an area that we've seen a lot of growth in. If you have a good experience with, blueberries at a reasonable price, there's no reason you wouldn't come back and buy 2, 3, 4 punnets. And then your repeat purchase goes up, you probably just continue doing that. And the 2 bits I want to just sort of touch upon is this stock turn frequency and this value density. So if you look at a retail shelf, retailers, one of the metrics of retailers' performance is profit per square meter. How much return? I'm a real estate agent. How much return am I getting on this square footage? Now, if you look at apples compared to, say, berries, and you can see the value difference there, then if you add to that, well, what happens with the stock turn frequency? So you're turning that stock over 2.5 times a week. For apples, you're probably getting $250, whereas for berries, you're getting $1,200. And actually, I put it as 2.5 times. Ryan, I don't know if you know off the top of your head what it will be, but it's probably more like 3.5, 4 times. So the cash contribution, the turnover of that category could be significantly higher because of the value density of that product. The other thing we've seen go really well is branded products, and that was, again, talked about this morning. And this is around premiumization versus that commodity mindset. And, a brand is a symbol of trust. So people know it's going to be consistent, generally consistent price, consistent quality, and a consistent value proposition. And the value proposition being what you have to offer, why it's relevant to the needs of your target consumer, and why it's better than everything else in the market. And that is so critical. And it's remarkable how many businesses don't know what their customer value proposition is. And this then leads on to premiumization, because these products are essentially premium. And, premium can be any of these things here. It's just pulling out the attributes that resonate with the consumers. What's your consumer wanting? What are the attributes they value? How do I package that up and communicate it to consumers? And the point here is it's about storytelling. The more adjectives you can use, The better you tell your story, the better your margin will be. And the meat industry do this really, really well around provenance. Tomatoes is probably a case study as well, where you can say, look, from low price, low quality, higher price, high quality, a great job in building that premium market. I used to buy tomatoes at Sainsbury's 20 and a bit years ago, and 50% of the category turnover was up there, and about 70% of the margin sat up there. Now, that is getting a little bit commoditized now, but what this does, it's all about per unit price increase. You're taking a price up from $4 to $4.50. That's increasing the total category value, which is how buyers get targeted on how their bonuses are dependent on. So it's about category growth. So very effective. So moving on to just going to touch upon the supermarket inquiries that have been happening in Australia, which have been playing out for the last 18 months plus. And there have been a whole load of inquiries looking at every aspect of competition between the major supermarkets. And there's been quite a bit of press coverage of this as well. Now, whilst that's been going on, these guys here, this Roy Morgan, do their consumer sentiment survey, and they say, what are the 10 most trusted brands in Australia? And you can, distrusted, and you can see Coles and Woolies at the top there, and that was whilst all this was playing out. And that's quite a feat, given Qantas, and I don't know if you've got the press over here, but Qantas absolutely imploded. They were getting hammered on a daily basis in the press. Yet Coles and Woolworths were put up there. So you think, well, all supermarkets would be tarnished by these inquiries and the perception. Yet then you look at the 10 most trusted brands, and they're Aldi sitting at number 2. And that, again, is just extraordinary that they can just, not get caught up in this. They just deflect incredibly well. So one way of saying, are the supermarkets profiteering or not, is to look at the profit pool in Australia. So this isn't public data, just to acknowledge this is data that Barrenjoey have provided. It's not public data, but it gives a feel for what's happening in the marketplace in terms of the profit pool between suppliers and retailers. Now, if you look at what's happened in the history of this, we had Aldi came into Australia 2001, we had the GFC, we had the first Coles Down campaign. That was 35% deflation across 15% of the 15% of the product lines in the supermarket. So unprecedented deflation for the Australian market, which obviously built market share. Deeper down happened 3 or 4 years later. If it ain't broken, why fix it? Keep the marketing going. Worked pretty effectively. And then you had COVID, which was that sugar hit that really closed down food service and out of home, and it drove it into the supermarkets. Now, if you cut this data slightly differently, and you look at it from the profit pool in terms of supplier and retailer, and you look at the trend, there is a downward trend with profit migration moving to supermarkets and away from suppliers. And again, if you look at the margins of Coles and Woolies, you can see, their margins are actually above average. They're at the top end of against global peers. They do have higher margins. But when you overlay on top of that, what is the investment they have made into their supply chains to capture efficiencies, which is absolutely critical in a country like Australia, where having a good cool chain in a hot climate and huge geographies, actually you would say, you know what, they've invested and they're getting the return, so it makes sense that they do have above average margins. So then you ask yourself the question, well, what is the real reason for so many of these inquiries? And I would say that, same happened in the UK, same's happened in many, many Western markets. When there's a cost of living crisis and the government needs someone to point the finger at, it is almost always the major supermarkets that take the heat, rightly or wrongly. That's just what happens. It was interesting that the Australian Prime Minister came out and said, well, we're not going to entertain any structural solutions, forced divestments. And that was because it would probably put prices up. But who's going to want to have stores in regional remote areas like Alice Springs and Darwin's, where getting stock there is just so expensive? So I think, if you reflect upon the Australian example and that data, it sort of suggests that the Australian market is relatively competitive. I think the challenge for fresh produce is that as growers and suppliers, you ultimately want to know, well, I don't want, retailers manage the margin mix of the produce category. You don't necessarily want them making more margin in apples and less in cherries. You want to have a fair share, and that's possibly something that needs to be resolved. If I look at the New Zealand market, I popped into a store. This is a Woolies store just where I was last week, and tomatoes at 15, 14.90, and chicken was at 12.90. I understand it's due to seasonality and cost and so on, but from a consumer's point of view, affordability and not being able to maintain that sales velocity and that loyalty to keep them buying, I think is a collective challenge for producers and retailers, because that's not good for business. That's not going to increase consumption and demand of fresh produce. So just in summary, consumer insights, understand precisely what your consumers care about. The more specific you can be, the better you can articulate your value proposition. Premium gets a higher price. It's got to be taste. Taste has to come first, and then it's about consistency. Number 3 is the true partnerships. The closer you can work with your retailers and suppliers together, will accelerate growth. And then finally, just knowing your customer value proposition. So if you come up to someone in the lift, you should be able to say, it's worth paying a premium for my product because. Absolutely critical. Thank you.